This is Anthony Podoratrad, continuing through the works of Bishop Hay, addressing the happiness of serving God. Here in this particular section, Bishop Hay is going to address a common objection, which is this. If it's true, or since it's true, that one who serves God in this life is content, at peace, and that true happiness can be found by serving God and eternal life in the next. Well, how is this possible? Because we see daily is that the wicked are in possession of many goods. They appear happy and joyful, while those who serve God are deprived of them and are suffering and unhappy. Okay, this is the common objection. Uh, the the wicked flourish and the righteous suffer. So if it's true that true happiness comes in this life by serving God and obeying His commandments, then why is this the case? Okay, that's the objection that's being raised to Bishop Hay, and that's the objection that he's going to address. And I think this is obviously a very common observation or common objection that we see. I mean, we see this even in the Psalms. You know, they cry out to God for why is it that the wicked flourish? So I'm serving you, but yet the wicked are flourishing and I'm suffering. You know, kind of observation, kind of this objection going on. And Bishop Hay addresses it, but first he says we have to understand that there is two kinds of happiness and two kinds of suffering in this world. There's the external and the internal. Okay. And he's going to explain that. He says that external happiness consists in the enjoyment of things which are agreeable to our flesh and blood. It's agreeable to self-love and our natural inclinations, such as bodily health, ease, and the possession of worldly goods, riches, honors, and the esteem of others. Okay. He says this is the happiness that the world offers us. He says external sufferings, on the other hand, consist of being deprived of these things, right? And afflicted with contrary evils which give pain to self-love and our natural inclinations. He says internal happiness consists of inward peace and contentment of soul, when the mind is satisfied in itself, is free from conflicting inclinations and desires. Internal misery consists in discontent and disturbances of our mind, when the heart, dissatisfied in itself, is torn asunder by its passions. Now, this is an important distinction to recognize, okay? What Bishop Hay is going to argue and demonstrate is that what the Catholic experiences when he serves God, obeys God, and keeps His commandments is internal happiness, peace of mind, contentment in in his life, in what he lives. That cannot be gained by anything other than obeying God and obeying His commandments and serving God in this life. That internal contentment of mind is the true reward, okay, of serving God. As well as obviously eternal life in the next, but in this life, that true happiness comes from that internal contentment, that internal happiness. Now, Bishop Hay will say that the external happiness that we see in the wicked, okay, all the amount of all the wealth that they have, just the eases of life and so forth, doesn't necessarily equate to having internal happiness as well. One can be completely filled with all the material things of this world and have all the external happinesses in this world, but what they will not have is that internal peace of mind. That struggle is that there's a conflict between the external happiness and the internal happiness. Okay, so the two don't always go together. Likewise, uh, the so let's say the Catholic can have an internal peace of mind, but not necessarily have external happiness, right? So he could be full of peace of mind, but yet be suffering in the world, in the eyes of the world. But yet in his mind, in his state in life, he is content with whatever comes his way, because he serves God and obeys his commandments, and God gives him that peace of mind in the sufferings he experiences. So this is how Bishop Hay is going to basically how he's going to answer this, is that just because we see the wicked thriving, they have all those external, happinesses of wealth, riches. The internal state of their soul and in their mind is at conflict and never satisfied and never happy. Right. I mean, this is something I think we can definitely see. Right. Just look at all the wealthy people and the rich people that we see as being successful in the eyes of the world, just so utterly miserable. They're always in and out of rehabs. They're always in and out of some sort of like psych ward or whatever. They're attempting to commit suicide. There's all kind of issues going on with them, and that's because they're seeking enjoyment and happiness in the things that the world can offer that don't give those things. They're never satisfied with what they have. They're constantly seeking more, and that brings about that conflict of mind. Here's what Bishop Hay says here. He says, though a man may have earthly enjoyment in abundance, yet he can never be truly happy without peace of mind. But on the contrary, if he has this peace, though he be deprived of all worldly enjoyments, though he be in poverty and sickness, and even despised and calumniated, he is truly happy in himself. Hence, the wise man says, quote, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasures without content. He says the apostles were poor and despised by the world. They were cast into prison, loaded with chains, and scourged in the most ignoramus manner, and yet were so happy and contented, and they rejoiced under all their sufferings. So Bishop Hay is going to give us some examples of what he's addressing here. He goes on to say that the most ample possession of worldly goods is of itself incapable of satisfying the human heart, or of affording its internal peace in which true happiness consists. He says, this we see from daily experience, both in ourselves and others. We often imagine that if we had such and such a thing, we would be happy and content. But no sooner do we obtain them that we are disappointed and find ourselves as far as ever from being satisfied. Some new desire intrudes itself upon us, some new object in which we expect to find the wished for contentment, but the moment we possess it, we find ourselves no nearer to happiness than when we were before. We may indeed find a certain satisfaction in acquiring the object of our desire, and this may continue for a time while the phantom of novelty lasts. But this be dissolved, and the soul begins to feel her former hunger. That mighty void again appears with no created thing to fill it. Quote, he's from Scripture, says, the eye is not filled with seeing, says the wise man, and neither is the ear filled with hearing. A covetous man shall not be satisfied with money, and he that loves riches shall reap no fruit from them. So this is what this we see in our own life too, that if we're seeking worldly possessions, if we're seeking happiness in the things that the world can give us, they may give us for a moment. We're glad that we achieved this. Yes, we got this next step. We've achieved this next step in our life where we've gained a certain amount of wealth or gained certainness, and I'm happy with that. But then next, that wears off. It fades. That honeymoon fades, and now I'm striving for something more. I'm always seeking more. I might get it and then I'm not happy with it anymore. It's this constant strive for something new to fill the void that you're looking for, and maybe it could be taken away. So there's this constant struggle between the external and the internal that's going on with those who are seeking enjoyments in the things of this world. Bishop Hay goes on to say that he says the same divine oracle assures us that it is impossible to satisfy the desires of man with any earthly object, as to fill hell with destruction. He says, quote, hell and destruction are never filled, so the eyes of men are never satisfied. And that's from Proverbs 27:20. It says Solomon, he gives example of Solomon, the most wealthiest and most successful and wisest king that Israel ever had. He says, Solomon gives us the most convincing proof of this from his own experience. He says, if ever any man could have been happy in the enjoyments of this world, he surely was the man. He had it entirely in his power to gratify every wish of his soul, and he set himself to do so, on purpose to see if it would make him happy. And it's quoting Solomon. I said in my heart, I will go and abound with delights and enjoy good things. I made me great works. I built me houses and planted vineyards. I made gardens and orchards, and I set them with trees of all kind, and I made me ponds of water to water therewith the wood of the young trees. I got me men servants and maid servants, and had great family, and herds of oxen and great flocks of sheep, above all that were before me in Jerusalem. I heaped together for myself silver and gold, and the wealth of kings and provinces. I made me singing men and singing women, and the delights of the sons of men, cups and vessels to serve to pour out wine. I surpassed in riches all that were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also remained with me. And whatsoever my eyes desired, I refused them not. And I withheld not my heart from enjoying every pleasure, and delighting itself in the things which I prepared. And I esteemed this my portion, to make use of my own labor. Right? So he did everything he could to seek all the pleasures of this world, and he had the ability to do so, and he sought them. It says, after such an ample enjoyment of all earthly pleasure, would we not conclude that Solomon was happy indeed? Asked Bishop Hay. It says, yet it was quite the reverse. He declares in what follows, not only that his heart was not satisfied, but that he found himself rather more miserable than before. And when I turned to myself, he says, to all the works which my hands had wrought, and to the labors wherein I had labored in vain, I saw in all things vanity and vexation of mind, and that nothing was lasting under the sun. I think it's interesting to notice here, he says that he noticed that everything was vanity, and then he says vexation of mind, that nothing was lasting. So he didn't have, Solomon, although he had all that external happiness, he didn't have that internal peace and that internal happiness in seeking the things and the pleasures of this world. Right? He had his mind was vexed still. Why? Because it was just momentary. He was looking for the next thing. This is of anybody in this world. Solomon would have had peace of mind and he should have had external happiness and he should have had internal happiness, but he did not. He only had the external happiness, but without the internal happiness, it has no value. It has no meaning. It doesn't give one peace. It doesn't make one happy in this life. What matters is that internal peace, because you can have all the external, but if you're not internally satisfied, it's meaningless. As Bishop Hay says, he says, it must further be observed that this vexation of mind, which accompanies even the possession of these enjoyments, is infinitely increased, so as even to render the soul completely miserable in the very mindset of them. He says, if there had been anyone violent, passioned, unsubdued, or unsatisfied. Here he mentions King Ahab, and this is an interesting story. If you're familiar with the story of King Ahab, he was obviously king of Israel, and he had all these earthly abundance and earthly happiness and great power and so forth. and he had everything that he wanted, but yet he was not happy or satisfied because he saw that Naboth had this plot of land that I think had a vineyard in it, and he wanted it, and Naboth wouldn't give it to him. So he had everything he wanted in life. He was happy. He had everything he wanted, but yet that didn't satisfy him. He still wanted more. He wanted Naboth's vineyard, right? He wanted Naboth's vineyard. So what happens? He's sitting there whining and crying, just pouting. And his wife says, "Hey, what's the deal? Why are you pouting?" And he says, "Well, Naboth doesn't want to give me this." You know, and so his wife comes up with a scheme in order to get it. Here's Bishop Hay mentions. He says, and he quotes from the scripture here. It says, "And Ahab came to his house angry and fretting because of the word that Naboth had spoke to him, saying, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And casting himself in his bed, he turned away his face unto the wall and would eat no bread." So he's there whining. It says, Bishop Hay goes, how convincing a proof is this of the insufficiency of all earthly goods to satisfy the soul of man, since the want of such a trifle could make even a great king miserable. It says, no courtier perhaps was ever more in favor with his prince than Ammon was with King Artaxerxes. Now, here he gives another example of King Haman, in the story of Ruth. That King Haman, of course, was wealthy, rich, same thing. He was high up there in the king's court. He had whatever he wanted. He had the favor of the king even, but he was so miserable and in mind because Mordecai wouldn't want to bow down to him and serve him. So he said, "I'm not happy with anything unless Mordecai, just unless I see Mordecai, whatever, punished or whatnot." I mean, this is the kind of people. This is the examples that we have. This is what he says. He says, "This is what Haman says." He says, "I think that I have nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting before the king's gate." I could have all these things, but unless I have Mordecai to that he just doesn't want to listen to me, that it offends my pride, and my external happiness is not happy. My external happiness, I don't feel like I have external happiness, and now my internal happiness is not met because he's just filled with pride, and he has no sense of contentment because guess what? He has no care about God or serving him. So we see that what an instance is this of the vanity of all earthly things, says Bishop Hay, when we see such a trifle embittering all their sweets and making one miserable in the midst of such abundance of them. So they're not content. And these two, Solomon, Haman, are representative of all kinds of people in this world that are wealthy, that have all the external happinesses that one would want, but yet they don't have internal happiness because they're seeking it in the things of this world. Now, Bishop Hay goes on to say, "Is another circumstance which no less clearly shows the impossibility of finding true happiness in the enjoyments of this world is this, that as in this life no one can be free from crosses, disappointments, afflictions, no abundance of worldly enjoyments can possibly deliver the possessor from these sufferings or support the mind in peace and tranquility under them. They cannot ease pain, relieve from sickness, support the soul under infamy and good disgrace, much less can they give the smallest ease when the mind itself is oppressed by dejection, melancholy, and despair." Right? He says that something else to take in mind too is that you might have all these external happiness, but we live in a fallen world, so we're going to be facing all these. Everyone faces these sufferings, all these different things that he just said. We all face those things. So, what are your riches and stuff going to do to fight to stop those? He says, "This is what Isaiah says. It says, what will you do?" says Isaiah to all such, quote, "in the day of visitation and in the calamity which cometh from afar. To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your glory?" And here Bishop Hay gives the example of King Antiochus in this situation. He says, of this, the unhappy king Antiochus is convincing proof. It says, after many victories and conquests by which he increased his power and glory, he at last met with disappointment in attacking a rich city, which he desired to plunder, and was obliged to depart in sadness. At this crisis, intelligence was brought to the Jews, had defeated another of his armies, and that they again repaired the city and the temple, which had been defaced and polluted. It says, and it came to pass when the king heard these words, that he was struck with fear and exceedingly moved. And he laid himself down in his bed and fell sick with grief, because it had not fallen out to him as he imagined. And he remained there many days, for great grief came more and more upon him, and he made account that he should die. And he called for his friends and said to them, sleep is gone from my eyes, and I am fallen away, and my heart is cast down for anxiety. And I said in my heart, into what tribulation am I come, and to what floods of sorrow, wherein now I am. And I that was pleasant and beloved in power. So he was. This is another example of a king, riches. He tried to take over this particular city of the Jews, and it just didn't go his way. And so now he's all upset. He's no longer has that internal peace. He's continually trying to get to the next thing, and he can't achieve it, right? So Bishop Hay says, see here how one disappointment undermined at once the happiness he had in all his other enjoyments. Nor were they able to support him under the load of grief and dejection into which he had fallen, of which he soon afterward died. He says, and all this brings us to another consideration, in which shows still further how incapable all worldly enjoyments are to give us that contentment of heart in which alone true happiness consists. And that is the instability of these enjoyments, right? That they're here today, gone tomorrow, right? I mean, we know that anybody could, at one point, we can lose these things and burn in a fire. We can lose the house. Any kind of natural disaster can happen that we have no control over, right? So there's no way that these, and we know this too. We know this. So if we put our hope and trust and enjoyment in these things when they can be gone here today, gone tomorrow, can't always ever truly give us internal peace and happiness. He says, Bishop Hay goes on to say that the certainty we have that in a short time we may be forever torn from them by death or by some calamity. It says, what solid peace or contentment can a man enjoy in the possessions of any earthly pleasure when he reflects that it may be taken from him, that he must soon be deprived of it, that he must forever lose it, without the smallest hope of ever regaining it again? Nay, the more attachment he has to it while possessing it, the more his torment must be at the thought of losing it. And when the hour of death approaches, who can conceive the agony of his soul? Right? If he has passed his days in disobedience to the law of his Creator and in neglect of his salvation, as is the case with those who seek their happiness in worldly pleasures, what must be his misery at the hour of death, from the sight of a deceitful world that has now forsaken him, from the stings of a guilty conscience which now upbraided him, and from the expectation of a dreadful judgment which now awaits him, and from the indignation of a just God whom he has provoked, and from the endless eternity that opens to his view, and from the secret voice that tells him in his heart that this eternity will be to him an eternity of woe. What will his riches then avail him? What consolation can his past pleasures then afford him? What support can all the honors of this world then yield to comfort his dejected soul under his load of sorrow? Absolutely none, right? Because when he lays down there in his death, he knows that none of that stuff that he acquired all his life can do anything for him at that moment of death, that hour, that most important hour. He goes on to say, there can then be no true happiness in worldly enjoyments, for any man capable of reflecting on the important truths here laid down, if he will not willfully blind to his eternal interests. I'll conclude with this, and we'll continue going next time in this section of Bishop Hayward goes on about the happiness of serving God and how the things of this world can bring no true happiness. Ave Maria.